Jason Kelce just destroyed the Cleveland Browns with one brutal sentence, and it sent their billionaire owner into a complete meltdown. The retired Eagles legend didn't just criticize the franchise, he exposed their entire house of cards with surgical precision, leaving Jimmy Haslam pacing his office like a man who just discovered his life savings had been invested in monopoly money. What exactly did Kelce say that turned Cleveland's front office into a war zone? The answer cuts deeper than any playoff loss or draft bust, because this wasn't about one bad game or one questionable decision. This was about a systemic failure so obvious that even a retired offensive lineman could diagnose it from his couch. But that wasn't even the worst part. Kelce's comments came at the worst possible time for Cleveland. The Browns had just started believing their own hype after a surprising season that saw backup quarterback Joe Flacco drag them kicking and screaming into playoff contention. Fans were finally allowing themselves to dream. Merchandise sales were up, and the front office was high-fiving like they'd cracked the code to NFL success. Then reality came crashing down in the form of a Philadelphia Eagles legend who decided to tell the truth. The Browns are one quarterback injury away from total collapse, Kelce said during a podcast appearance that would haunt Cleveland for months. Those 13 words weren't just an opinion, they were a mathematical certainty wrapped in brutal honesty. One name changed everything: Deshaun Watson, the $230 million guaranteed quarterback who was supposed to be Cleveland's savior, had instead become their financial prison. That's $230 million, enough to buy a private island and still have money left over for a yacht. When Kelce pointed out this elephant in the room, he wasn't just taking shots at Watson's performance. He was highlighting a fundamental flaw in how the Browns operate as a business. Jimmy Haslam's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Sources close to the organization described a scene straight out of a corporate thriller. The billionaire owner storming through the halls of the Browns facility, demanding to know why a retired player was getting more media attention than his carefully crafted PR narrative. This is the same man who has turned the Browns into his personal laboratory, cycling through coaches and quarterbacks like they were expired products at a grocery store. The irony cuts deep because Kelce wasn't wrong. He was prophetic. Watson had already missed significant time due to injury and suspension, looking rusty and disconnected when he did play. Meanwhile, Joe Flacco, a quarterback Cleveland had signed as an afterthought, was slinging passes downfield like he'd discovered the fountain of youth in his backyard. Every Flacco touchdown was a reminder of how much money the Browns had wasted on Watson. But here's where Kelce's analysis gets truly devastating. He understood the salary cap mathematics that many fans overlook. Watson's contract doesn't just eat up money, it devours roster flexibility. Nearly a quarter of Cleveland's entire salary cap is locked into one player who can't stay healthy and hasn't performed at an elite level. That's like trying to build a house when you've already spent most of your budget on an expensive foundation that keeps cracking. Unless Watson wasn't the real problem. The deeper issue Kelce identified was Cleveland's pattern of desperation. This is a franchise that convinced itself Johnny Manziel was the next Joe Montana, doubled down on Hugh Jackson like he was a coaching genius, and traded away dignity to roll the dice on Watson. The Browns don't just make mistakes, they compound them, turning single errors into generational disasters that haunt the franchise for years. Haslam's fury wasn't really about Kelce's comments. It was about having someone say out loud what everyone was thinking privately. NFL owners hate losing control of the narrative, especially when that narrative involves admitting they've mortgaged their team's future on a gamble that isn't paying off. Kelce represented everything Haslam couldn't control: an outside voice with credibility, platform, and most importantly, nothing to lose. The timing made it even worse for Cleveland. This happened during a season when fans actually had hope, when the Browns looked like they might finally break their decades-long curse of mediocrity. Kelce's words landed like a meteor in Cleveland's carefully constructed fantasy, reminding everyone that this success was built on quicksand, not solid ground. Watson's real numbers told a different story. The quarterback Cleveland thought they were getting, the Houston version who could escape pressure and make throws that defied physics, seemed like a distant memory. Instead, they got a player who looked uncomfortable in the pocket, hesitant to make the plays that once made him special. Every Watson incompletion was a $230 million reminder that sometimes the most expensive solution isn't the best solution. Then came Joe Flacco, like a ghost from football's past haunting Cleveland's present. The man was literally at home, probably thinking his NFL career was over, when the Browns came calling out of desperation. What happened next was equal parts inspiring and humiliating. Flacco played like a quarterback half his age, while Watson collected guaranteed millions from the bench. Flacco exposed the Browns' biggest lie. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Here was a quarterback the Browns found in their emergency contacts, outperforming the player they'd bet their entire future on. Every Flacco bomb downfield was a dagger to the heart of Cleveland's Watson narrative. Fans found themselves in the twisted position of cheering for a 39-year-old backup, while their $230 million franchise quarterback watched from the sideline. Kelce understood what many fans couldn't articulate. The Browns weren't just struggling with their quarterback situation. They were trapped by it. They couldn't cut Watson without devastating cap consequences. They couldn't trade him without eating a massive financial loss. They were stuck, like someone locked in a contract for a house they couldn't afford in a neighborhood that was falling apart. But what Kelce said next didn't just expose the Browns, it predicted their exact downfall. And Jimmy Haslam was about to discover that $230 million guaranteed doesn't buy you an escape route from reality. The AFC North isn't a division where you can hide your weaknesses. It's a meat grinder where every team is built to punish exactly the kind of vulnerabilities Cleveland was trying to paper over. The Ravens have Lamar Jackson, a human highlight reel who runs like he's playing a different sport than everyone else. The Bengals have Joe Burrow, who could probably throw accurate passes blindfolded. Even the Steelers, perpetually sorting through their own quarterback chaos, still manage to grind out wins because Mike Tomlin refuses to let that franchise collapse. The AFC North doesn't forgive financial mistakes. Cleveland entered this gauntlet with a quarterback room held together by hope and prayer, anchored by a contract so massive it prevented them from building the kind of depth needed to survive the division's weekly beatings. When Kelce pointed this out, he wasn't being cruel. He was being realistic about the mathematical impossibility of Cleveland's situation. Haslam's meltdown intensified because he knew Kelce was right. This wasn't some random hot take from a morning show host desperate for clicks. This was analysis from a Super Bowl champion who understood what winning organizations look like. Kelce had spent his career in Philadelphia, a city that knows something about brutal honesty and championship expectations. When he looked at Cleveland, he didn't see a contender. He saw a franchise trying to convince itself that expensive mistakes were actually strategic investments. The media storm that followed was predictable but devastating. Sports talk shows devoured the story, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Headlines screamed about Cleveland's crisis. Debates raged about Watson's future, and rival fan bases piled on with the kind of glee usually reserved for holidays. Even worse for Haslam, many Browns fans didn't defend their team. They agreed with Kelce. That's when the math became terrifying. Cleveland's championship window wasn't just closing, it was slamming shut with the force of financial reality. Watson's contract ran for years, eating up salary cap space that could have been used to build around their elite defense. Every year, they couldn't maximize that defensive talent was a year wasted, and years don't come back in the NFL. Players age, coaches get poached, and opportunities vanish faster than playoff hopes in December. Kelce's analysis went beyond just the quarterback position. He understood that Cleveland's problems were structural, built into the very foundation of how they operated as an organization. This was a franchise that had been chasing shortcuts for decades, always looking for the quick fix instead of building sustainable success. The Watson trade wasn't an anomaly. It was the latest chapter in a book titled How to Stay Mediocre While Spending Like Champions. The defense that had carried Cleveland to their surprising success couldn't stay elite forever. Players would get injured, contracts would expire, and coordinators would get hired away for head coaching jobs. When that inevitable decline happened, the entire weight of the team's success would shift to an offense anchored by a quarterback who looked like he was still trying to remember how to play at an NFL level. One injury changes everything forever. This wasn't hyperbole. It was mathematics. If Watson got hurt again, which seemed likely given his injury history, Cleveland would be back to scrambling for emergency solutions. They'd already seen what happened when they had to rely on backup plans, and while Flacco's fairy tale run was entertaining, it wasn't sustainable. You can't build a championship roster around hoping a 39-year-old quarterback will have another magical season. Haslam understood this too, which explained his increasingly frantic public statements trying to control the narrative. Every interview became an exercise in damage control. Every press conference, a desperate attempt to convince people that everything was fine when everyone could see the house was on fire. The more he protested, the more obvious it became that Kelce had struck a nerve. The Browns' front office tried to push back against Kelce's assessment, but their arguments fell flat because they were arguing against arithmetic. You can't dispute salary cap numbers, or injury reports, or won-loss records. The facts were the facts, and the facts supported everything Kelce had said about Cleveland's precarious position. Even Kelce didn't see this coming. The reaction from Cleveland's fan base was perhaps the most damning element of the entire saga. Instead of rallying to defend their team, many Browns fans openly agreed with Kelce's assessment. They'd lived through decades of disappointment and had developed a sixth sense for recognizing when their team was heading for another disaster. They could smell the impending collapse before it happened, and Kelce's comments only confirmed what they already knew. This fan reaction cut deeper than any media criticism because it came from people who desperately wanted to believe in their team. These weren't rival fans looking for reasons to mock Cleveland. These were Browns supporters who'd invested their emotions and money into the franchise year after year, only to watch the same patterns repeat themselves with different players and coaches. The contrast with Kelce's own Philadelphia Eagles couldn't have been more stark. The Eagles had built sustainable success through smart roster construction, shrewd financial management, and a commitment to developing players rather than buying expensive shortcuts. When Philadelphia won their Super Bowl, it was the culmination of years of patient building, not the result of a single desperate gamble. Cleveland, meanwhile, kept trying to buy their way to success without understanding that championships are earned through consistent excellence, not purchased through guaranteed contracts. The Watson deal represented everything wrong with their approach: massive financial commitment, desperate timeline, and hope that expensive solutions would solve fundamental problems. The receipts tell a different story. Looking at the actual performance numbers, Watson's production didn't justify even a fraction of his contract. His completion percentage, touchdown to interception ratio, and team record when he played told the story of a quarterback who was no longer elite. Meanwhile, Flacco's brief resurgence showed what competent quarterback play looked like in the same system with the same supporting cast. This comparison wasn't just embarrassing, it was financially devastating. Cleveland had essentially paid Super Bowl winner money for backup quarterback production, while their actual backup outperformed their franchise player. It was like buying a Ferrari that could only drive in first gear while borrowing your neighbor's Honda and discovering it could outrace anything on the highway. Kelce's criticism resonated because it came from someone who understood both the player perspective and the business side of football. He'd been part of championship organizations and knew what it took to build sustainable success. When he looked at Cleveland's situation, he saw all the warning signs that the Browns' front office was either ignoring or hoping would magically resolve themselves. The psychological impact on Cleveland's roster couldn't be ignored either. Players aren't stupid. They understand salary cap implications and can see when their team's financial flexibility is being hampered by poor decisions. When your highest-paid player is underperforming, while an emergency signing is carrying the team, it creates a cognitive dissonance that affects everyone in the building. Jimmy Haslam's continued protests only made the situation worse. Every public statement defending Watson felt like a man trying to convince himself that his expensive mistake was actually a brilliant strategy. The more he doubled down on the narrative that everything was fine, the more obvious it became that everything was very much not fine. The brutal reality was that Kelce had perfectly diagnosed Cleveland's terminal illness. They were financially handcuffed to a declining asset in the most competitive division in football. There was no easy solution, no quick fix, and no amount of positive thinking that could change the mathematical reality of their situation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Kelce's analysis was how it revealed the cycle Cleveland seemed trapped in. They would panic, make desperate moves, convince themselves those moves were brilliant, then panic again when reality set in. The Watson trade was just the latest iteration of a pattern that had defined the franchise for decades. The Browns had become the NFL's version of a gambling addict, always convinced that the next big bet would fix all their problems. They never learned that sustainable success comes from making smart, patient decisions rather than trying to hit the jackpot with one massive gamble. Kelce understood this because he'd been part of an organization that built championship success the right way. As the season progressed, Kelce's predictions began coming true with frightening accuracy. Watson continued to struggle. The defense showed signs of wear, and the magical Flacco fairy tale came to its inevitable end. Cleveland found themselves exactly where Kelce said they would be, exposed, vulnerable, and one injury away from complete collapse. The most painful part for Browns fans was watching their team's championship window close in real time. The defense that had given them hope was aging, key players were approaching free agency, and the massive Watson contract prevented them from making the moves necessary to keep the window open. Every wasted season felt like another nail in the coffin of their Super Bowl dreams. Haslam's increasing desperation became evident in his public statements, which grew more defensive and less coherent as the season wore on. He'd gone from confident owner to a man trying to convince the world that his house wasn't actually on fire while smoke poured out of every window. The more he protested Kelce's assessment, the more prophetic those words seemed. Looking back, Kelce's comments weren't just criticism. They were a perfect diagnosis of everything wrong with modern Cleveland Browns football. He'd identified the core problem, financial inflexibility, predicted the inevitable consequences, vulnerability to collapse, and explained why the situation was unlikely to improve, structural issues with decision-making. The tragedy for Browns fans was that they could see it all happening exactly as Kelce had predicted. They'd invested their hopes in Watson's redemption story, only to watch it become another chapter in their franchise's book of expensive mistakes. They'd believed this time would be different, only to discover that hope and guaranteed money don't automatically translate to championship success. Subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking chapter. The Browns story is far from over, and if Kelce's track record of predictions holds true, the next few seasons could be even more devastating than anyone imagines. Hit that notification bell, because this train wreck is just getting started.